Alright guys, no camera today. I wanted to do a video on this when this whole thing started going down. But I've been extremely busy. In fact, I'm extremely busy right now, and I probably should be doing something else other than this. But I can't help myself. Alright, Russia, Ukraine. We hear a lot about it. And the level in which things have changed over just the past 72 hours, it's actually incredible. The initial reports of when the Russians coming in having destroyed all the Ukrainian air assets, it looks like that was a feint. Ukraine's still in the fight, and not only are they still in the fight, they have essentially completely stopped the Russian advance. And for some reason, Putin has made it a tactical priority to grab Kiev. He wants to force a surrender or something by taking the capital. Even if he takes the capital, that's not going to end the fight at this point. So I'm not 100% sure what he's doing tactically. I think he thinks it might end the fight. It would demoralize the Ukrainians a bit, but there has been some majorly grave miscalculations on the Russians' part, and honestly, things that I didn't know. I should say I didn't know or expect when I looked at the numbers. The idea with the defense of the Ukraine, we're talking pre what just happened, was essentially that these eastern provinces here, this stuff was effectively almost completely lost before the war even started. They have a major Russian insurgency issue. They've got locals who feel themselves to be more Russian than Ukrainian. And there probably could have been very logical negotiations to get basically these pieces back reincorporated into Russia. It's not all that... Basically, when the Soviet Union collapsed, some of their borders essentially... It's not all that different than kind of what happened in World War One, where entire countries disappeared. Certain areas that maybe historically belonged to one nation now were split up for various reasons. And the Germans felt disenfranchised by it. In this case, Russia and the Ukraine were kind of brother states. They didn't really... they were always on the same page, so it never really mattered about who owned Crimea, who owned the provinces in the east, even who owned Kiev. But of course... it's been many years since that, and the Ukrainians have basically shifted the way the Poles have gone into the Western influence. And the Ukrainians have been dealing with, not only did they deal with essentially their Russian puppets, because they've, a political party that's just, they're just Russian. There's no other way to describe it. Like, they're not, they believe the Ukraine is part of Greater Russia. And then the other side, which is more of a liberal modern approach to it, and that's more of a coalition government, which is why you'll see Zelensky had like 75% of the vote. That's very uncommon in a democracy, but in his case, it just was a matter of them voting out essentially the corrupt Russian oligarchs. Now, Zelensky. One of the arguments against Zelensky when he was being run was that essentially he was not in the know. He wasn't greasing the palms or in the good graces of the American and European political elite. The idea being basically you pay off the Biden family, and then they're more likely to be, basically to sell you weapons, do things, put stuff on the line to make sure you don't get invaded by the Russians. And Zelensky wasn't a sellout. And the fear was essentially when Trump got elected was that he would basically screw over the Ukrainians and say, no, it's your country, keep yourself safe. We're doing our own thing. I don't care about your issues with Russia. Luckily, particularly for the Ukrainians, a lot of that was propaganda. Trump actually... He was the first president to sell them weapons, not blankets and food, but missile systems and particularly anti-tank infantry weapons like javelins and stuff. That was that's the backbone. The infantry are the backbone of the Ukrainian defense, and the fact they've held on, it is in no short part to essentially the fact that the Ukrainians have had now Javelin for a couple years, which means basically their people are trained up with it. You can drop off anti-tank missiles and you will get effectiveness, but if you really want that to be an effective piece of your infantry fighting force, they have to have it for a few years. They know how to incorporate it and use it and all that kind of stuff. All good. Trump sent them a lot of good stuff. Allowed them to buy a lot of good stuff. Weapons manufacturing, particularly. You see a lot of these videos of these guns being handed out. A lot of these are to the civilians and the reserve. A lot of these are made in the United States. They at one point had adopted the WAC or WAC 47, which was essentially a AR-10 that was, chambered for, I guess it was, an AR-10, battle rifle, but that was chambered for AK 47 ammo, 7.62 by 39, which was basically just a bolt swap, and I think the mag type was even the same somehow. But it was basically a bolt swap and a barrel swap away from being a 5.56 and being NATO compliant. Luckily for them, Poland and Romania have plenty of ammunition from basically the old Soviet era lying around to give to the Ukrainians for this fight. But you could see basically Kiev was positioning to essentially move into the Western sphere and move out of Russia's influence. Now, the Russians did not like that. So what they were trying to do is essentially reassert their power, say, no, you're an Eastern Bloc state, and we're going to own you. The threat, tactically, was that, okay, Russia, roll your armor in, but the second you basically make a move to start crossing the river, or you start rolling your columns in, NATO Air Force will be there, and you'll have to deal with the air power of NATO. You'll have to deal with a no-fly zone. It'll make it very frustrating. That was kind of the policy of the Trump administration, and to much criticism and controversy, because that's they're a non-NATO state now that's just going to pull us into a war because the Russians want to attack them. It's not a good look, but it did keep the peace. The Russians didn't do anything under Trump. In fact, he basically said, if you try to basically take over the Ukraine and stop them from essentially deciding their own destiny, we're going to bomb you, and we're going to place bombs in Moscow, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about it. And for whatever reason, whether it be intelligence or just prudence, the Russians believed President Trump, and they left the Ukraine alone. Of course, they always fund their insurgency, and there's propaganda and whatnot. But in terms of the hard military hardware rolling over the border, it didn't happen under Trump. Second Trump was gone, he obviously had really good intelligence that none of the threats that the Biden administration were making were sincere, and he just started basically building up troops for quote-unquote an exercise. And then now they've invaded. Now we see what's going on. I would have, if I, as somebody who analyzes this stuff, I was not buying some of the naysayers who were saying that, Russia, they don't have the logistics in place to project to be doing this type of war, so they're not going to do something. And I wasn't convinced of that, because it's like, they didn't have the logistics in place in Crimea either, and they still did it. And the second they rolled those peacekeepers over the border, I knew the fight was on. Because if you do that and then there is no response from your opponent, it's just like when Hitler took the Sudetenland. Basically, the response of the West was to negotiate it away. So then the next thing he did was basically, wow, they're so afraid of war, then all we have to do is just, threaten them with war, and we can pretty much attack wherever we want. So they rolled into Poland, they rolled into the rest of Czechoslovakia, and just, basically weakness invites increased aggression. And Putin called Biden's bluff. The NATO air cover that was supposed to occur and was basically stop the Russians from getting over the river. stop them from landing Marine troops in Odessa, stop them from crossing the basically the borders in the north, moving Belarus, whether it be Belarusian forces or Russian and or probably both at the same time, crossing over that border and basically laying siege to Kiev. That's what the air cover's about. Basically, make this a pocket where the Russians cannot safely operate in the air, and the Ukrainians, through attrition, can probably do the rest. That never materialized. Those first 24, 48 hours where a NATO quote unquote response was expected simply did not occur. And the Russians had calculated correctly that yes, the West was weak. We were not willing to send troops to defend the Ukrainians. We'll smile and we'll use it for political gain, but we're not willing to go die to defend the Ukraine. And there was also a lot of people who were saying early on, like, oh, if you want to defend the Ukraine, you're going to need to put a 250,000 troops there. And that's not a winning political proposition. You can't do that. If you do that, you pretty much guarantee that your political career is over. Committing a 250,000 troops to a country that just entered a relationship with the West was not going to be popular, especially not after Afghanistan, not after Syria, and all this other stuff. It was not on the menu. We were very, very weak in that way, and the Russians exploited that. They fully exploited that. So, good call on the Russians. They had better intelligence than. Certainly me. I'm looking from the outside. I'm going. I think there probably will be at least a no-fly zone, which would be a big problem for the Russians. And here, the Russians they made the calculation that basically the Biden administration was weaker than even I thought they were, and they were correct. So, wow, that occurred. But what's happening strategically here? Strategically, what Putin originally was going to get through just sheer osmosis was these eastern provinces. The Ukrainians did not have the global support or really the manpower to basically completely secure this area and crush the insurgency and throw the Russians out, especially not at great cost of civilian lives. They've been fighting back and forth, but the fact that there's been no killing blow shows you basically the difficulty of what the Ukrainians are dealing with. This is like New Jersey fighting against the United States to get free. Only New Jersey now has a country next to them that's fully supporting them. And we're saying, no, you're a state. If you want to leave, you have to do it the legal way. And they're just saying, no, we want to join Russia or be independent or something. And then, we send troops and they send troops, and then it's a mess. And there's really no easy solution to what's going on. That's what was happening. And what I figured that if basically it got hot, they would move in and they would basically try to secure what's going on this side of the river. That is not what happened. The Russians went way further than I had been anticipating. They rushed forces up into basically this separatist region of Moldova. So Moldova's in this fight too. People don't really realize it, but Moldova's in the fight as well. And that's really not making Romania happy. It's just that Moldova doesn't have the, let's just say, they're definitely old school Soviet third world looking country. They don't have the Instagram models and all the propaganda the Ukrainians have, but Moldova's dealing with this at the moment as well. So we shouldn't really forget them. But if Putin wanted Kiev, which is the most heavily defended city in this country, because it's the command and control center, I thought his strategy would be essentially surround them and starve them out. And I don't necessarily mean starve them out in terms of like starving for food, but basically make it so that they cannot effectively redeploy any sort of counterattack, and they've lost access to the Black Sea. That is what I expected. The Russians initially did push into Odessa. They struck Odessa. Their lines met together, and they met with essentially the Moldovan insurgency, the forces they were putting in Moldova. And they had cut this area off within the first, 24, 36 hours. And when I saw that, I thought, well, it's over. If the Russians have Odessa, and the Russians essentially had the Black Sea coastline, Kiev cannot last without essentially NATO troops coming in, like Poland coming in with like a huge force and attacking Belarus and dragging all these other countries into the fight. So Kiev would have to negotiate. They would essentially have to negotiate away half of their country, and then just be kind of over a slow amount of time, essentially just be drained just from the Russians having occupied Odessa and controlling the Black Sea. As you can see, Ukraine, without essentially access to the Black Sea, would be completely landlocked. They'd have a hostile neighbor to the north, and they'd be screwed. That, to me, seemed like the most probable strategic objective that the Russians were going for. And that's what they did in the first 36 hours. But what happened was not something I don't think anyone was anticipating. The initial reports of the Ukrainian military, logistics, radar, and air force having been basically destroyed by the Russian attacks were not true. The Ukrainians very much essentially shifted their forces around and made the Russians think that they had done a lot more damage than they did. When the Russians moved up their paratrooper forces, particularly in the north to take bases in the north and areas basically to bring in heavy equipment, the Ukrainians didn't do a good job of stopping that. I saw the Russian air cavalry run in, and I was like, if they're not able to stop basically poorly supported airborne troops, and if they're not able to stop them from landing, they're going to have a hell of a time basically pushing them out, especially once they lose these airfields. But that's not at all what the Ukrainian strategy was. The Ukrainian strategy was to allow Russia to essentially put their tip-of-the-spear forces as far up as possible. And then, within 48 hours, begin the counterattack, but not counterattack the forces that were essentially at the points of incursion, like furthest in. Instead, the counterattack occurred on the logistical lines that the Russians were desperately trying to establish to make sure that basically the forces they have around the area, and particularly in the south, were fully supplied. There was a major fight, essentially, just outside of Crimea here, basically crossing the major rivers for bridges. You'll see that video of the one dude who literally basically manually detonated the explosives, killed himself to take out a bridge to stop Russian armor from crossing into western Ukraine. The Russians had built up a large force in Crimea, and they were planning on marching it out and taking Odessa and holding it. And that would be, in my opinion, the killing blow. That stopped dead. The Ukrainians essentially hid their assets, sacrificed a lot of territory to make sure that did not occur. So somebody basically read their art of war, and they knew what was important in all this, and they distributed their forces. The operational security for the Ukrainians has been absolutely incredible. It went from essentially the international community saying, Kiev is going to fall in 2 days, and the Ukrainians are screwed. And, there was the propaganda, oh, woe is them, they just got crushed. To now, the Russians they've got essentially a fight similar to Finland in the 30s. This is not going well. They have stopped. Their tanks are out of fuel. Their men are having to raid convenience stores for food. The armor columns that were supposed to essentially secure Odessa, which was then going to allow essentially the Russian Navy just unlimited supplies coming in from Odessa, and then pressure from the north, pressure from the south. The whole area is wide open, right? They stopped them. The Ukrainians stopped them. The Russian naval forces that were besieging Odessa have either retreated or been destroyed. And we don't know. There's not a lot of info. The Russians are being very hush-hush about what's destroyed. But they essentially landed Marines in Odessa, launched their Air Force, expected their armor columns to come up and be the support force and basically finish off the Ukrainians, and it didn't occur. The backup never arrived. And for however they did it, which I don't know, we don't know the specifics of, the Ukrainians stopped the Russians from being able to reinforce the units they tried to basically advance force they tried to put in Odessa. The Ukrainians, did they stop them? Whether they retreated or whether they were destroyed, basically they made it untenable for them, and they're not that they're no factor, but the Ukrainians have control of the area, and this is a huge problem for the Russians, because their failure to take essentially Odessa and the southern coastline means that the Ukraine can fight indefinitely. As long as these supplies are coming in from other nations, whether it be Romania, Poland, anybody else, Hungary, Slovakia, just, because they're basically putting it in the sea, heavy equipment, food, weapons, repairs, personnel coming in. The Russians are now fighting. It's like they're trying to plug a leak, but this is the fire hose that's on. And they not only did they fail to shut it off, they've essentially, now it's working full flow. And the Ukrainians are just, they focused on this area. They sacrificed the suburbs. They sacrificed airfields. They sacrificed Chernobyl. Not that they didn't fight for these places, but they sacrificed all of these areas where you see basically the Russians were able to push into to make sure they kept their eye on the prize and held essentially the southern coastline. The Russians are screwed right now. They're absolutely screwed. I did not expect the Russians to fail in the way they have failed. And a lot of this is essentially the Russians blitzkrieged. But imagine blitzkrieging and then not taking Paris. Imagine the French kept up the fight, right? They pushed past the Maginot Line, but the Germans were never able to push into Paris, right? And then, while that's occurring, the French Air Force is now bombing the logistical trains and supplies, and in that case it was horse and carriages, coming in to support the troops of the Germans who had already basically advanced into France. You would say, well, the fight would have collapsed, right? Like it's they've got they don't have their opposition's command and control. They don't have their opposition's ports. That's a losing fight for basically a light mobile spear force that's a blitzkrieg force. This is what the Russians have done now to themselves. They've sent in their airborne, which is lightly equipped, but they can be dropped anywhere. And their goal is to essentially secure airfields, secure strategic points, take out specific types of defenses, and clear the way for the heavy machinery. And okay, they landed, but the heavy machinery is not arriving. The areas in the south are not there. The areas these light paratrooper forces are holding, they're not connecting with the Russian lines. A good example would be Normandy. Could you imagine if the Normandy invasion occurred and the beach assault had been repelled? Right? The Americans, British, Canadians, we never got off the beach. What happens to the airborne forces? What happens to the airborne forces that landed further down? Well, they can't clear a path now because, even if they have cleared the path, the beaches basically are not secure. So the backup units that are supposed to resupply them haven't arrived. So what do they have to do? They have to basically take strategic cities and make it really difficult for, that's the best they can make of it, short of surrender, right? So that's what we're seeing. That's why we're seeing these fights for Kiev. Every day and night, the Russians are renewing a push for Kiev. And every time they do that, unless they have a military success, they're losing they're losing equipment, They're losing food. They're losing sleep. They have to take Kiev. If they do not take Kiev, not only do they have to capture the supplies of Kiev, they have to actually have some sort of strategic victory so that they can actually negotiate with the Ukrainians to actually end the fight. If they do not take Kiev with this now cut off force, those guys are screwed. They're screwed. The airborne forces, the light guys, the Spetsnaz, the forward guard, the tip of the spear is screwed because the support's not coming. And the Ukrainians have done a very good job of essentially cutting off those support arteries that the Russians very early established. And it's just shocking the level, the ability the Ukrainians have had to basically outmaneuver the Russians and hold on to what matters. I don't know where their commanders studied. I've been hearing, like a lot of their armor schools, like people went to like U.S. colleges and stuff, and that would make sense. But it's not just a matter of where, even so much as just these guys who ran the war on the Ukrainian side. I don't know if it was a surprise to them or not, but they've done it now without NATO support, without the air cover that the Ukrainians were depending on. And they have stopped a technologically superior, numerically superior, and politically superior force from essentially achieving their grander strategic objectives, which was essentially the surrendering of the Ukraine. Had Putin just moved into these provinces, it probably would have caused the standoff. It would have been maybe not as strategically advantageous for the Russians because then the Ukrainians would have had time to get their act together. But he would probably keep it right now. We'd just be all talking about, whatever, the Russians just moved in and take it. Basically punt the war to next year or to 5 years from now or something, right? But he didn't. He went for the throat. He said, okay, let's basically take the South, cut them off, take their capital, force them to sign a treaty that says, basically, sorry, Russia, we promise not to flirt with NATO anymore. And those objectives have not been achieved. It's actually I think I said this already, but it's shocking the level of denial that the Ukrainians have imposed upon the Russians' primary strategic objectives. The Russians don't have any cards to play. They're desperately trying to take Kiev. I suspect if that fails, their next push will be trying to do something to take the Odessa area. The problem they're going to run into is that now every NATO and every navy in the West is going to start to line up here, and they're not going to want to drag in other. Basically, they're not going to drag in on other fronts, other countries. They're not going to be like, oh yeah, well let's cut off the Ukrainian supplies and push into Poland through Belarus. That will not that doesn't help the Russians. That's going to drag in a country that will put so much man and equipment basically on the scene that the Russians who are already in dire straits will be they'll be annihilated if the Poles get involved. The resupply efforts, they're going to start sinking Romanian ships to stop the resupply to the Ukrainians. They're going to sink a NATO nation vessels that are now resupplying the Ukrainians to fight. That won't end well. They do that, an aircraft carrier shows up on the scene. Well, maybe not carrier, but nonetheless, the amount of warship power that will show up to defend this area is not something the Russians can deal with. They blew their wad. They had their shot. Well, this area was essentially unguarded to move in, take Odessa, secure the coastline, secure essentially the pathways from essentially Russia to southern Ukraine, to Moldova, really. They're probably would just... If this went successful, they'd probably be just moving into Moldova next. And it didn't. Ukrainians just stopped them. They just completely stopped them. This is not something we've seen before. This is not what was predicted by the majority of the analysts. I was wrong when I thought, well, NATO won't allow the Russians to essentially move a full force in past the river. I was completely wrong about that. NATO had way less way less of a spine than I had been anticipating, and I put that mostly on the Biden administration. Way weaker of a spine than I could have anticipated. But the fact the Ukrainians are in the fight and actually not only have held Odessa, but have now basically kept it as an asset and are repelling, the legions of Russian forces who clearly don't want to be there. I've seen the interactions between civilians and the Russian troops. The Russian troops don't want to be there. Especially these guys came in from the north. They were in Belarus doing a training exercise, and then it was, just kidding, we're actually invading the Ukraine. These guys weren't ready for this. They weren't ready for, Babushka with the AK popping out of a bush and killing 4 of their friends. It just, it's just not who these guys are. They're not interested in basically massacring basically massacring the millions of people it's going to take to basically make any kind of long-term progress in holding the territories that now they've rolled into. And now they're out of fuel. And now they're out of food. And now they're out of communication. The videos I've seen coming out of these Russian troops who just don't have any orders, they're just kind of waiting around. Those guys are not going to go take their own initiative and, they're not defending the motherland. If they were defending Russia, you don't need orders to be essentially a thorn in the side to whoever's attacking you. But if you're the aggressor and you don't have orders, you better, you better be fighting the orcs or some sort of historical enemy who you have, actual cultural animosity towards. Not strategically we don't like that the, Ukrainians are cozying up to the West. And this is not unlike with this is not unlike Tiananmen Square, with the way that is with the Chinese, right? The average Chinese person doesn't know anything about Tiananmen Square. But if you live in Taiwan, you know about Tiananmen Square. You know about the oppression of the Chinese government. And you know how horrific that's going to be. And you're going to be fighting to the last man to stop that from occurring to you and your family and your country. The Ukraine suffered, talking in the tens of millions of deaths, starvation, genocide under the Soviet Union. And the West, not only did the West not do anything about it, not that they even could, but the media just didn't report this. This wasn't something that was well known, historically documented. The Ukrainians knew it had occurred, but they had, it was covered up. It wasn't taught in schools. The Ukrainian language was nearly exterminated. The Ukrainian Jews were nearly wiped out. Just the amount of suffering under the Soviet occupation, the Ukrainians dealt with was just shocking. But while the Soviets had very tight grip on the media to cover those things up, that is not how it is now for Russia. The average Russian can look up and see what the Soviet Union did to the Ukrainians and realize that they starved out 10 million of them. Maybe that's why the Ukrainians are fighting to the last man, because they know the consequences of the last time the Russians took them over. The ones in the East, they're ethnically Russian. They feel like this is part of Russia, right? Whatever, the kulaks, they don't care. They're culturally Russian. That's why they're fighting. You start moving into the West, you're dealing with essentially a people who were almost exterminated the last time the Russians moved in. It's a whole other ball game. And these Russian soldiers going in, they know they're not welcome. They know they're coming in and they're doing essentially committing the same sin that Stalin did. And they're going to say, oh yeah, no, sorry, don't worry. We won't starve you to death this time. Trust us. Even though you gave up your nuclear weapons so that the Russians wouldn't invade you, and then we just did it anyway. Like, they know this is a losing fight. This is a culturally losing fight. It's a politically losing fight. And unless they marched in, immediately crushed their opposition, killed the basically the politically outspoken, and just said, yep, this is ours now, come get it. Now that hasn't happened, there's no way the morale for these guys can be anything but just vapid. I wouldn't want to. I feel bad for the Russians who are pushed into this. Everybody says, "Oh, they should just refuse their orders." That's not how things work, all right? They love their country too. They've been ordered to come down and do something. They don't 100% know why. Now they're here. They probably feel like they've been abandoned by their leaders because they're not getting supplies, they're not getting food, they're not getting fuel, they're not even getting orders. They don't know what they're doing. They were told, yeah, take the capital to Ukraine. Why? What did they do? What did they do? Over here, you understand. Oh, there's propaganda about ethnic Russians being oppressed. Fine, but the Western section, what's going on? They want to take Kiev to secure the eastern provinces. Well, they secured the eastern provinces without doing anything to Kiev. So, what's the point? Are you going to go march and die like in Stalingrad? Is this a strategic city? No, the strategic city to win the fight was down here in Odessa, and they blew that. So what's the point? Other than the political victory of taking the capital to save face. These guys are not going to line up and die by the... Not going to die by the hundreds of thousands to take a city that they just don't care about. That they would so much rather just be at home. There was 5, they said they committed all 5 Spetsnaz brigades to the Kiev area. Well, if they were going to win, they would have done it by now. Those guys would have done it. And they weren't able to. Whether they deliberately didn't want to, or they just simply weren't able to achieve their objectives, or, they were thinking, oh, there's going to be plenty of people who are friendly to Russia who are going to surrender. And they're finding out, no, actually, even people, including the political opposition to Zelensky, have all taken up arms to go push back the Russians. Because they just know, they're like, wait a minute, all right. Even if they're pro-Russian, the legitimacy they have of arguing, of arguing essentially we should have closer ties to Russia, has now completely evaporated. I mean, if only to save face, you got to put up a fight to stop them from conquering you. And I don't know what the Russian... I don't know what Vladimir Putin's going to do at this point. He's threatened the use of nuclear weapons. So, the Russians aren't stupid. That if they fire nukes at somebody, they're going to get glassed. What Russian, even Putin is going to want essentially. Yeah, you know what? This is an embarrassment for me politically. And I think to cover that up, I would like to start a nuclear war that ends with me dead and my Russia that I love so much completely glassed. Of course not. They're not. It's not that ideological. Let's say they're not as there's a lot more going on, and the Russian people, even since the time of the Soviet Union, understood there is something sacred about the Russian homeland, and they do not want to see it devastated, whether it be by the Germans or because of a nuclear exchange that could have been avoided. That's the thing, man. They start sending. They do shit with their bombers, man. They're gonna get the Russians. They have the potential. If they escalate this further, whether it goes to nuclear conflict or just straight up regular military or economic conflict, they stand to lose so much more than anybody they could drag into the fight. You know, Russia could blow up the United States overnight, and that would not help them keep the Ukraine. All that would do would just basically mean Poland now has an excuse to essentially crush Belarus and march on Moscow. Romania is seeing the Ukrainians with their limited personnel and technology hold off the Russian hordes, and the Romanians are like, hordes, not hordes. The Russian hordes too, pouring in probably. The Romanians, who have been basically cross-training with the United States for about over a decade now, Pennsylvania National Guard, they're in and out of Romania constantly. They're actually like the brother force or whatever. They cross-train. They're seeing these completely unsupported Ukrainians giving absolute hell to one of the most technologically advanced adversaries on the planet. And they're just thinking, hey, if the Ukrainians can do it, we definitely can do it. You know, and we've got NATO's backing. So that's all I wanted to touch on. I know that was a little long, but that's essentially the macro explanation of what's going on. The Russians were not able to hold Odessa and to hold the coastline. And that has now had a devastating effect on the Russians' ability to continue prosecuting the fight. I don't know where this ends, but even if Kiev doesn't hold on, which it looks like they're going to be able to hold on almost indefinitely, unless the Russians do something down here and somehow turn this completely around, they're done. They can't win. They can't win. And I did not expect that. I expected the Russians, if they were going to full-scale attack, and if you said, yeah, but NATO support's off the table, I would say, well, they're going to take Odessa, and then Ukraine's screwed. It's over at that point. It's like when the Germans lost Stalingrad. A lot of people say, oh, that was the basic turning point in the war. The Coral Sea, the Japanese lost that. And then it was just only a matter of time, essentially, like until the fight was over. Well, I got news for you. The Russians have lost the South here, and unless there's something, we don't know about, like a secret, essentially another push to go take it, which I don't think is possible at this point, fight's over. The fighting is not over. The war will still happen. This will be a very, very painful, long fight. When I say long, I just mean, it's not over, but the ability for Russia to achieve their strategic objectives has died right here. Those bridges got taken out. Odessa was held. The resupply routes from the Black Sea into southern Ukraine have basically held on, and the Ukrainians control them. Whoops, Putin, you done screwed it up. This should have been his main focus from the start. And the fact that they didn't have essentially a plan B, C, D, and E to make sure they secured this coastline means it was either poorly thought out or the Ukrainians are, the most fierce fighters the planet has ever seen, which I don't think is the case. I think they're very good, obviously, but they're not like, special backwoodsmen or something. Like this is a country that's just basically Eastern Europe on its way to modernizing. They're like me and you, it's their home, but they're not like a special Spartan warrior culture or anything. There's no reason on paper why the Russians should be struggling this hard, other than the Ukrainian commanders did exactly what they needed to do to make sure, essentially, the king piece did not fall, and the Russians they failed. I mean, what are they going to do? Okay, you take Kiev. Okay, now what? Now what? That's just one less point the Ukrainians have to defend. That's all that turns into. They want a street to street fight in Kiev, like some like essentially hard base Fallujah. They want that. They think they can win that, and that's just going to be a huge drain on their own resources. They're thinking they think the political victory will be worth it to take it, and it's not. It's not. I don't know what the Russians are doing at this point. That's just they're trying, but hey, you know what? Stuff can turn around overnight. But the way I see it right now is the Ukraine single-handedly has essentially prevented a almost guaranteed world war conflict. Had the Russians taken this? Remember the Russians, their whole argument for the Ukraine not being essentially associated with NATO is that they didn't want to border a NATO nation? Fair enough. Except for the fact that if you invade the Ukraine and take it over, now you're bordering two NATO nations. Like, they're full of crap, basically. So by them taking over the Ukraine with no response and it going horribly, they were inviting conflict between essentially Russia and the rest of Europe. And then likewise, that level of weakness from NATO and the United States then begets the Chinese and moving into Taiwan and so on. You were looking at a 1936 situation where it only gets worse. You're looking at major bloodshed over the next decade. But the Ukrainians single-handedly have turned that around. They said, nope, we are not going to be the first casualty in this fight. I mean, God bless them. Just, I'm shocked. I'm shocked. I'm proud of the Ukrainians. I just the way they've been able to hold on against what's going on here. It's just the Russians aren't pushovers. They're not a joke. Russians are tough people, but the Ukrainians are clearly more resourceful, more cunning, and more willing to fight than anyone had given them credit. I think had NATO known the Ukraine was going to be capable of putting up this level of defense, they probably would have, just supported them with Air Force early on. Because, it's a winning fight. But I think they abandoned them because they were like, oh, well, they're just going to give up. Clearly not. So, damn. What a strange week in terms of world events. What a strange war. This is never seen. Well, I should say I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. And the closest thing I can think of is the Winter War with Finland. And the Russians will take and probably keep these two provinces. And then they'll say, oh, well, we won because we got to keep a piece of it. Yeah. And I'm sure that was totally worth that fight you picked with Finland. I'm sure all those bodies and equipment you stacked were totally worth it. For what they got in return. And with the Ukraine, it's looking like it's going to be a very similar situation. So, wow. All right, that's that.